For those of you that don't know, Herceptin is a monoclonal antibody that is quite successful against certain kinds of breast cancer, hence its importance across the world. There is a link between some of the speakers today, and the next speaker is Carolyn Miles, who is the CEO of Save the Children, an old colleague of mine in that part of my life. Carolyn was also an entrepreneur, and she might say a little bit about that before she joined Save the Children. It's a great pleasure to have her here today because she's literally going to fly to Iraq in about 3 hours' time. So if you have any questions for Carolyn, we're not going to be able to do that at the question and answer session, but you might be able to have a conversation over coffee, I hope, because I'm sure she'd enjoy doing that. So Carolyn is going to address similar issues, but from a different perspective, really from the perspective of an NGO. Actually, Save the Children is the world's largest NGO for children, independent of the United Nations. So I won't say any more. Carolyn, it's all yours.
So thank you. Thanks to Mick for having me today. And I am on my way to Iraq. Maybe we'll get a chance to talk about that a little bit. And I actually probably maybe could do a couple questions at the end because my presentation hopefully is a little bit provocative, but it's not actually that long. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the business of doing good. And Mick mentioned I actually was in the corporate sector for about 15 years before I came to Save the Children. I worked both in big business, so I worked for American Express, and then I did start a coffee company in Asia called Pacific Coffee Company, and any of you that might have lived in Asia might have seen it. And I think that when I came to the NGO world, it was probably a good thing that I didn't know anything about the NGO world. Because I am not quite sure I would have actually been able to make that switch if I had known more than I had. And I didn't, and that was actually a good thing. I think the other good thing, and I actually continue to try to do this, is to keep one foot in the business world because there are so many things that are relevant to the work that we do. We work in 120 countries. We have about 15,000 people around the world, and so there's a lot of things that are relevant about the business world. But what I wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about today is some of the things that are similar to what Chris talked about, but looking at it from a bit of a different perspective. And the changes that are happening in the world that I live in, which is about development, and it's about giving every kid in the United States and everywhere around the world a better opportunity for a better life, and the things that businesses are doing. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how businesses are making these choices and how NGOs like Save the Children are working with them on some of these issues. This is going to be a little bit more about this idea of unlocking social value by doing good business. And I think you've all probably heard some of these terms that have been thrown around. It might be called shared value. It might be called core business. But the essential idea is that you embed this idea that your business can actually do good while you do business as not a philanthropic thing that you might do if you make enough money at the end of the year. Not a thing that you do so your employees feel good, not a thing that you say it's just the right thing to do and I'm going to do it over here, but really a core piece of what your business is all about. So this idea, I'll use the word shared value, is where you bring together society and business. And the person who has done the most work, I would say, in this area is Michael Porter out of Harvard. And he says the concept of shared value resets the boundaries of capitalism. And it's the next major transformation of business thinking. I actually would tell you I am not sure that's actually true. And the reason I would say that is that if shared value and this idea that every business out there can really change the world and really solve the social issues of the world, so poverty, huge inequality, hunger, lacks of education, if that were actually true, then I think we all would have done it, and we all would have made lots of money doing it. Because who would not say that they want to make money and do good? None of us. There isn't a person in this room that wouldn't say, that's a good thing, let's do it. It really is not that simple. And this idea of shared value, I have to tell you, having worked on many, many of these projects, I'm not sure that it really is possible for most companies. I'm not sure about this idea of shared value. So I stand in front of you as a skeptic, I guess, on this idea of shared value. And I'll talk a little bit more about why. I would say there are a couple of companies who are close. P&G, by the way, is not one of them. I would tell you that P&G is behind some of your competitors in this area. And there's two that I'll say a little bit about. One is Unilever, and Chris mentioned it. And one is Reckitt Benckiser. I think they're both competitors of P&G. They are further ahead in this area. They are looking at products that actually defeat disease. They are looking at the idea that I will incorporate my business in emerging markets in a way that will actually benefit those that I'm trying to serve in a very different way. So they are ahead of you in terms of these kinds of partnerships. Another company I might point to is Glaxosmithkline. So Save the Children just announced about 2 weeks ago a new partnership with Glaxo. They're actually developing a nutritional product for undernourished kids. And they think they can make money doing that. I'm not sure they can make money doing that, by the way. But they are looking at this as an overall partnership. So those are a couple of companies that I think are maybe on the verge of making this happen. But I think that really what we're talking about here is a concept that I would call more blended value. And this is a combination of maybe our old ways of thinking about philanthropy, our new ways of thinking about core business or shared value, and the third way, which I think Chris called the fourth sector, which is what I would call social enterprise, but usually on a relatively small scale. And I would say that what we're really talking about is blended value. And in order for that woman that you see in that picture, who is a mom in India, where, by the way, 300,000 kids will die the day they're born, and that baby, to have the same kind of opportunities that I would have, that is going to take a different kind of model, I think, than the ones that we're talking about right now. So I would like you to think about this concept of blended value, which actually takes these three different things, traditional philanthropy, and that, frankly, used to be, for Save the Children, the major way in which we engaged with corporations. They wrote us a check. We did a program. That was very much the way up until probably 3 or 4 years ago, and actually still today. Many, many, many of our partnerships are what I would call traditional philanthropy. And there's nothing wrong with traditional philanthropy. It can actually have a lot of business benefits. It can actually engage your employees. It can make your employees feel really good about the company they work for. It can be done in a way that it actually drives forward part of your agenda, whether that's about education or whether that's about health. So it's not a bad thing. But when you put these three things together, the idea of traditional philanthropy, the idea of shared value, so the embedding these things that are doing good into your business in a way that drives your business, and then this social enterprise piece, I would say that is really the future in terms of how companies, I think, are going to be looking at doing good. I don't believe that a straight shared value model where you say, I am going to do everything inside of my business, and I'm going to do that in a way that it's going to drive my profit and it's going to do good, I don't believe that most companies will ever actually be able to make that work. I don't think that is the model. But I do think the combination of these models, traditional philanthropy, so kind of what you might think of as a zero return if you're thinking about your investment in terms of profits, but a large return in terms of social return, combined with shared value and combined with social enterprise. I think that is the real future in terms of these kinds of relationships and how companies will really look at how they do good. And I'll just talk about a couple of these. And I do have a P&G example. So this is an example that's getting there, but it's not quite there. But this is a program that Procter & Gamble started actually quite a few years ago. So in that case, actually, you probably were one of the early adopters of these kinds of programs. P&G, when I say you, I mean P&G. But it wasn't kept up. The organization, I don't think, stayed behind this idea as much as other organizations did. The idea here is that many, many girls drop out of school when they have their first period. And they drop out of school because they don't have any latrines. They don't have any feminine hygiene products. They don't have any health information. So a lot of times they aren't even sure what's happening. And there's very little support to girls to stay in school when they go through the first period. So we started a program with P&G that was really actually about education. It was about education. It was about keeping girls in school. For us, what it was about for Procter & Gamble was we're trying to build a market. So we did this program in two places in Africa, 2 countries in Africa, where there were no feminine hygiene products. They just weren't things that were on the market in those areas. So girls didn't have access to them. They were looking at, P&G was looking at, how do I build a market? How do I actually introduce these products and build a market? So this program built latrines. It did health programs for girls, for adolescent girls, and it supplied feminine hygiene products. So it introduced those products. Now, this was has been a very successful program, but it's a long-term view, obviously, in these markets. You're building a market, it's a long-term view. And I think the place where these kinds of programs can work is where you've got this synergy between the things that the NGO is trying to make happen, which in this case was keep girls in school and make sure they get an education, which is going to drive the education rate within that country, which is going to drive development of that country. That's what we wanted to do. And Procter & Gamble was really looking at how do we start introducing these products to the market. And that works when you have something that actually can work together. Now, if this was a cigarette manufacturer, obviously we'd probably have a little bit of a different opinion of whether or not we would do a program like this. But in this case, there's a good fit there between what we're trying to accomplish and what Procter & Gamble is trying to accomplish. And those things worked. Now, you probably wouldn't call this shared value at the beginning because I don't think that P&G made any money on this project, right? But in the long term, it's about building a market. And I think that's the other thing I would say about this new way of thinking about these partnerships is it has got to be a long-term view. Shared value, core business, any of those things will not be a short-term thing in terms of building your business. You've got to look at either I'm building a market, I'm building a new group of employees in an emerging market where I actually have my operations and I need to increase the level of education of those employees, for example, that pool of employees. So it's definitely a long-term view, and I think that's the other thing I would say about this new way of thinking about these partnerships is it's very long-term. I'll talk about a couple of others. Bulgari. So this is one where you might say, wow, a luxury jewelry brand and Save the Children, the poorest kids in the world and a luxury jewelry brand, how does that kind of work together? And one of the things that I think drives a lot of these partnerships is the ability to increase awareness. So for Save the Children, this actually was not, there is a financial piece of this, which comes from selling these rings that say Save the Children in them. But the piece that was actually more important to Save the Children in this case was the awareness of what Save the Children does. Because this campaign actually supported an issue that's really important to us, which is education for kids in crisis. And so this was a really important piece, not so much because of the money, but about the awareness. And for Bulgari, it was very important because it actually developed a new product for them. So they came up with a branded product at a much lower price point than they'd ever done before. And they introduced that into the market, and they have a new customer base because of that. They'd never sold anything. I'm not even sure what their lowest price point was before this, but these products were about $300. So I think that's quite low for them. It was probably in the thousands somewhere. So there was a benefit here, but a different kind of a benefit, not the one you might think about. And finally, I want to talk about what I think is emerging as what you might think of as the ultimate blended value. I don't know if anybody in the room knows who Tom's Shoes are. People know? Okay. So they have actually embedded this idea of social good into their very model of business. So for those of you that don't know, for every pair of shoes that they sell, they actually give a pair of shoes away to a child somewhere in the world. And Save the Children's a big partner of theirs. But they have decided that their whole model is based on giving back. They manufacture their shoes in Ethiopia, Argentina, and China. So they actually manufacture in places where they are trying to build, and in those places, not in the typical places in those countries where there is a lot of manufacturing. So they're manufacturing their products in those places where they want to be able to give back. They're giving back every time someone buys a pair of shoes. They have given away or will have given away 10 million pairs of shoes by the end of this year. They have been extremely successful. And they have said that this is actually about doing something to empower kids and to change their lives, not about making money. Not sure if I totally believe that, but because they are making lots of money. But they have said this is the way their model works. And now they've just introduced sunglasses. So when you buy a pair of their sunglasses, they give a pair of eyeglasses to a child or a person in need around the world who needs eyeglasses. So they are looking now at how do they expand this model. And it's been tremendously successful. I will say to you, it has taken a huge investment to do the giving part of this model. 10 million pairs of shoes that you're giving away is not something that you can do kind of off the back of a truck, right? There is a huge program that is part of this model that is about the giving part. Obviously, there's a huge part of it that's about the manufacture of the shoes they sell, but they spend almost as much money on the giving back part as they do on the selling part. And that really, to me, is an example of this new model. But they will also tell you that they are not as interested in their profitability as they are in what they're doing in terms of the social impact that they're having. One of the things that we talked to them about when I was there a couple weeks ago was how do we do a distribution of 100,000 pairs of shoes in a refugee camp in Jordan for Syrian refugees. But we didn't talk about it as we're going to go and give away 100,000 pairs of shoes. What we talked about was how do we actually engage the very disaffected young people in that camp who have had to leave their homes and who have been out of school for 3 years, and how do we engage them in setting up shoe shops where they can actually sell, quote unquote, the shoes to the other kids, right? those are the kinds of models that they're thinking about. They're looking at how do I increase the vaccination rates of kids by giving shoes away at the vaccination point to incent families to actually come and get vaccinations. So those are some really, I think, innovative ways of thinking about this concept. And I would say that is really where I think we're going, which is this combination, I would say, of traditional philanthropy, shared value, and social enterprise kind of all put together. And I think Tom's Shoes is what you're going to see in the future as a big part of this model that's going to come true. So I think that's actually all I wanted to say. And because I have to run off to Iraq, I am happy to take questions now, or Mick, if you want to keep going, it's totally up to you.
I think we can, what do you think? A couple of questions? Anybody have any questions for Caroline? There's one over there, right at the end. I don't know if we get a mic over there. Mick over there, yeah. Why doesn't Mick go over there? Why don't you tell me the question and the Mick will become the mic? So the question. Oh, here we go.
We found a mic.
And a Mick.
And a Mick. A Mick and a mic.
Caroline,
Yes.
I'm an entrepreneur. We're trying
Yes.
to be one. And I was listening to your concepts, to your presentation, and it's great. But I mean, you have been an entrepreneur as well. I
Yes.
mean, the reality is building share value. I mean, when you are trying to build shareholder value, is just impossible. I mean, how do you combine the two? Not going into a model that on itself, like the last one, is a social benefit model.
Yeah. I mean, I do think there are ways, and I'll give you an example from when we started the coffee company. So we did look at, from the very beginning, even when we weren't making any money, we did actually look at, so in this example, how are we sourcing coffee, and what were we doing in terms of supporting those families that were actually growing coffee, in addition to the buying of the coffee, but were there other things that we could do to actually support those families? And I think, again, another great example of a long-term view, and we're seeing more and more of this with coffee companies, with cocoa companies, supporting those farmers to be able to make at least a living where they can support their own families is a long-term investment that you're making in the supply chain in this case. And more and more chocolate manufacturers, for example, are looking at cocoa farming and saying, if we don't do something about cocoa farming, we're going to turn around and not have any cocoa to make into chocolate, because the situations are horrendous for the families that are involved in that kind of farming. So, I mean, that's an example of maybe looking at your supply chain, for example, and saying, is there something I can do in my supply chain that would actually allow me to do something that made social good right inside of that? And sometimes those things they don't cost a lot of money, and you can actually do them without a huge change in your profitability. But it is really hard when you're starting a business, having started one, and having to say, but I think that a lot of that goes back to the values of the company and what you say is important from the beginning.
We got another question for Caroline. Got one on, sorry, one over here, yeah, in the middle.
As you think about this new model, have you noticed skepticism from consumers? For example, as I did buy my Tom's, I was skeptical. Are they really giving a pair of shoes for the pair of shoes I bought?
Yeah. So the answer is yes, they really are, because
Yeah, and I don't have to.
I've seen them.
Just wondering
But
about
yeah.
skepticism from consumers.
Yeah.
How do you address it?
Actually, I haven't found as much of the skepticism among consumers when you put that piece out there in terms of that partnership. I think most people actually believe it. And I think if the company is really going out with that message, whether that's Bulgari with the rings and saying, proceeds of this are going to this Rewrite the Future campaign for Save the Children, or whether it's Tom's Shoes with buy one and we give one, I think most people actually believe it. And there's lots of research that says that if given a choice, consumers will choose those products that have some kind of piece that's giving back, or this social good piece. There's lots of research that says that if they're given the choice between two things and one has that benefit, they're going to choose the one with the benefit.
Even if, it seems to me there's an avalanche of it, like there's so many.
Yeah.
I was wondering if there's consumer.
The fatigue or,
Yeah.
yeah. I've actually seen it just continue to grow. Now maybe we will get to a point where there's so many models like this that people will say, oh, everybody says that, and how much different could it be? But right now I think there's enough differentiation, that people are making those choices.
Have we got one more question for Caroline? Gentleman here.
Hi, Craig Bida. I'm from Cone Communications now. You mentioned briefly Reckitt, Glaxo, Unilever. Could you give a sense a little bit more for us of what's happening in those companies and how you see that trajectory continuing? How deeply do you think that these companies will lean forward into this work, and what can we learn from it at P&G Group?
A short answer.
Yeah. So GSK, I'll give you a little bit more examples on that one. So GSK has actually launched this campaign, and they have said we're going to save 1 million lives of kids under the age of 5. And we're going to do that by working not just with Save the Children, but working with other organizations as well. And they're going to do a couple things. They're going to So there's a product they already make called Chlorhexidine, and it's the #1 thing that will prevent kids from getting infection through their umbilical cord when they're newborns. They're going to lower the price of that product and work with governments in 3 or 4 countries to actually get a huge expansion of the use of that product. So that's one thing they're doing. Second thing they're doing is they're developing a new nutritional product for malnourished kids. So they're investing in their own R&D over the next 3 years to try to develop that product. They don't think that that particular product will actually make money initially, but they are looking at that as a profit-making venture. And eventually, places like India, where the malnourishment rate is like 50%, and mothers will actually purchase these kinds of products for their kids. So that's the second thing. The third thing, they're just doing some straight kind of program support for really high mortality rate countries, where we're just doing some frontline health worker programs and things like that. I think those are the major elements. So and Reckitt is doing something actually on diarrhea, which is the number 2 killer of kids around the world. So pneumonia is the first thing that kids under 5 die of, and diarrhea is the second. And they are actually doing a huge campaign and using their cleaning products as ways to, and hand washing campaigns and hygiene campaigns to try to lower that rate. And doing some program things, etc.
Okay. For more information, see the website.
Yeah. Yeah. All right.
I know we could go on. I really know we could go on.
I know you have the rest of your program.
I'm getting all the rest of my team giving me hand signals saying, "Oh!" Anyway, I think.
Thank you.